I grew up in a world where 7 languages were spoken. On my dad's side of the family, my grandparents spoke Teochew, which is the provincial language of the part of mainland China where they come from. And they would stay with our family for a couple of months each year. They rotated among the different siblings. So I had the chance to play with my grandparents and they would speak to me in Teochew. And then every Sunday, we would go to my mom's parents' house where they came from, Hainan Island, so they would speak Hainanese. But there I picked up much less Hainanese because all the adults would sit together and talk and the kids would go off and play. So I know enough Hainanese to know when I'm in trouble and when you need to come back. But in the 70s, I think the Singapore government really discouraged the speaking of dialect. I think as a way of nation building and uniting the immigrant Chinese community. So dialect has kind of disappeared from the public space. Most people in my generation would not know how to speak dialect, and that's a big gap. My parents went to Chinese language schools because that's what they were encouraging all the ethnic Chinese to learn, either Chinese or English, and where you learned every subject in Chinese and then a second language like English. And those started to get phased out in the late 80s. I looked online and it said by 87. And I think the way my parents tell it is part of it was some fear of communism, like that these were schools that were culturally facing mainland China, which was under communist rule. And also because English was seen as the language of economic success, right? It's the international language. And so my parents chose to go to an English-speaking college. I don't know how they survived, where overnight they were learning everything in English, where previously it was Chinese, but they graduated somehow. So by the time I was born in 83, English education was widespread. And I went to school learning everything in English, and I learned a second language according to my ethnicity, which is Mandarin Chinese. But at the same time, there were 3 types of English happening in the house. Right? First of all, I was raised by a Filipino nanny who would listen to Rick Dees and the weekly Top 40. Did other people listen to that? No? Yeah? Yes. All right. So thanks to Rick Dees and my nanny, I have this incredible knowledge of old American music and a good American accent, right? But of course, in school, we were learning standard English, which sounds British. You have to hit your T's and you can't roll your R's. But really what most people were speaking on the street was colloquial English, which we call Singlish, right? Which is an amalgamation of Malay, dialect, Chinese. The syntax is kind of like Chinese translated into English. It's its own language understood by maybe 4 million people who were born and raised there. Then of course, because there was the Filipino nanny in the house, I would hear Tagalog when she spoke to her friends. And Singapore actually has 4 official languages. So there's English, Mandarin Chinese, there's Malay, because that was the language of the original peoples, right? Before the British arrived, there were actually people living there. And we sing the national anthem in Malay. So every day before school in the morning, everyone is standing there. For the Chinese, you're singing a language you don't understand and watching the flag get hoisted on the flagpole. So yes, I can sing in Malay. And we learn folk songs in Malay. And thanks to being in the choir in elementary school, we had to learn patriotic songs also in English, Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. So Tamil is the 4th official language because most of the Indian immigrants in the past came from the south. So out of the 500 languages of India, for some reason, we chose Tamil as the national language. So yes, I can also sing in Tamil, thanks to this education. So what was very difficult growing up, though, was that I never saw this multilingual universe reflected in any of the books or movies that I watched or read. And I used to wonder if something was wrong with my reality. We had 4 TV channels in Singapore, English, Chinese, Malay, Tamil, like these monolingual channels. And the TV shows always look really weird because nobody just speaks one language in the country. I read a lot of British children's books, which were all in English. I tried to branch into watching world cinema, but that's all, again, it's just all in one foreign language and you're reading subtitles. Eventually, when I learned French too, we learned le français de France, the French of France, right? You're not learning the French of Haiti or of Quebec. And I think I was 21 when I first saw this world that's multilingual reflected back to me in a book. And it was by a Nigerian author named Chinua Achebe, and his book is called Things Fall Apart. I was taking a class on post-colonial literature, And it's a book about a man from the Igbo tribe in pre-colonial Nigeria and what happens when the Europeans arrive. It's a tragedy. And that book made a real strong impact on me. It was the first time I was reading an English book with words from a foreign language totally woven in, right? Like just part of the tapestry. They had all these proverbs and words from the Igbo culture, and you had to check the back of the glossary if you couldn't figure out from context what it meant. And that was just amazing to me. It was like, oh, right, that's the kind of world I live in. It's just many languages kind of happening at the same time, and you figure out their meaning based on context. So reading post-colonial literature really helped me to make sense of the world I had grown up in. And these days, I will say the places I feel the most kind of foreign in are places that are monolingual or kind of monoethnic. They're kind of like a curiosity. I think I felt that way when I lived in France for a month, or even going to Taiwan for the full ordination. It's like, everybody speaks one language. That's so strange. Okay. And I feel very much at home at the Abbey because we've become this incredible multinational, multi-ethnic, multilingual community. And we practice Buddhism in many traditions. Kind of it's just woven into our practice. Right? We do practices both in English and Tibetan, and also practice from the Chinese tradition. And that makes sense to me, I don't know, because the Dharma transcends linguistic and cultural boundaries. And just reflecting on all this, the struggle of like trying to make sense of a world that's actually very multilingual, but just not seeing that represented, I feel very grateful that the Buddha encouraged his disciples to teach in their dialects. So I'm going to read you a little passage that comes from the Vinaya. It's a section, this is the Pali Vinaya that has been translated into English, and it's from the Skandaka section, or the Kandakas, I guess. I can't speak Pali. But it's called the Kulavaga, chapter 33. It's the 5th Kandaka on the daily life of bhikkhus. So it says, now at that time there were 2 brothers, bhikkhus, by name Yamalu and Tekula, Brahmins by birth, excelling in speech, excelling in pronunciation. These went up to the place where the Lord Buddha was, and when they had come there, they saluted the Lord Buddha and took their seats on one side. And so sitting, those bhikkhus spoke to the Lord Buddha thus: at the present time, Lord, bhikkhus differing in name, differing in lineage, differing in birth, differing in family, have gone forth from the world. These corrupt the word of the Buddhas by repeating it in their own dialect. Let us, Lord, put the word of the Buddhas into verse. And the translator has put Sanskrit in the bracket. How can you, O foolish ones, speak thus, saying, let us, Lord, put the word of the Buddhas into verse? This will not conduce, O foolish ones, either to the conversion of the unconverted or to the increase of the converted, but rather to those who have not been converted being not converted, and to the turning back of those who have been converted. And when the Lord Buddha had rebuked those bhikkhus and had delivered a Dhamma discourse, he addressed the bhikkhus and said, you are not, O bhikkhus, to put the word of the Buddhas into verse, Sanskrit verse. Whosoever does so will commit a wrongdoing. I allow you, O bhikkhus, to learn the word of the Buddhas, each in his own dialect. So that has always been a source of comfort and inspiration to me, that of course the Buddha was not going to set up as one language as inherently holy or sacred, but to speak the language that will allow people to access the Dharma the most immediately. Right? So, and I think a lot of ink has been spilled, perhaps, on the whole question of what language did the Buddha speak. Right? And I guess looking online, it seems, or hearing from different historical sources, it seems people put forward that he spoke Madagi Prakrit, right, which was the vernacular of the people of the time. But the Buddha's time was really one of great linguistic diversity. And even today, according to a 2001 census, India has 122 major languages and 1,599 others. It's kind of inconceivable, that there are a functioning democracy with this kind of linguistic diversity. So I found this article on Buddhist Sutras, Origin and Development by a Japanese writer named Kogen Mizuno. And in it, he points out that they found one of the edicts of Ashoka, right? So that was closer to the Buddha's time. It was carved in a different language in each of the 8 areas it was found. And each of these 8 languages correspond to the later 5 main languages used in Indian dramas of later periods. So I just want to read this little section. So he says, in those plays, one could identify a character's occupation and social status through the prescribed language he or she spoke. Kings, ministers, and Brahmins spoke Sanskrit, the most highly esteemed and inflected language. Queens, princesses, nuns, and courtesans spoke a graceful language called Shaura Seni. The general populace, such as merchants and artisans, spoke Magadhi, and the lower classes spoke Paishachi. My best guess is that the Buddha taught in whatever language was most helpful for his listener. And my favorite answer to that question, what language did the Buddha teach in, comes from the Lamrim Chenmo. So I'm just going to read this section from it on the good qualities of the Buddha's speech. So Jason Kappa writes, reflect on the marvelous manner of the Buddha's speech. Even if every living being in the universe asks him a different question at the same time, he comprehends them all with one instant of his wisdom. Then he answers all the questions with a single word, which all beings understand in their own languages. The chapter of the Truth Speaker says, it is like this. If all living beings simultaneously ask questions using many different expressions, he understands them in a single moment, and with a single utterance gives answers to each. Therefore know that in the world the leader knows how to be eloquent. He turns the wheel of teaching that eradicates the suffering of deities and humans.